Good afternoon, all. My name is Miranda Schreurs. I'm the director of the Trottier Institute for Sustainability in Engineering and Design. And, I'd like to start with welcoming you all to those in the room and those who are joining us online on this TISEDTalks event titled Climate Change and the War in Ukraine, Can Crises Stimulate Transformative Change? So I'm sure it will be a very, very interesting conversation. Before we begin, on behalf of TISED, I'd like to acknowledge that McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among indigenous people, a territory on which we are fortunate enough to gather today. Our event today is made possible by the support of the Trottier Family Foundation, and is also part of the Jean Monnet Network on EU-Canada Relations, which is co-founded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union. I got it all in. With that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Miranda Schreurs. Dr. Schreurs is Professor of Environment and Climate Policy at Technical University of Munich. Miranda's research areas are in international and comparative climate policy, environmental politics, and low carbon energy transitions. She's involved in projects examining the energy transitions in Germany and Japan, climate policies of Europe, United States, and China, and the politics of high-level radioactive waste disposal. In 2011, Dr. Schreurs was appointed by Chancellor Angela Merkel as a member of the German Ethics Commission on a Safe Energy Supply. From 2008 until 2016, she served as a member of the German Advisory Council on the Environment and is vice chair of the European Environment and Sustainable Development Advisory Councils. Dr. Schreurs completed her PhD from University of Michigan, and she's taught at numerous universities, including some in Japan. And for a period of 3 years, she was conducting research at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, working on a MacArthur Foundation grant. With that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Schreurs, and I'll hand over the floor to you.
Thank you so very much. So, it's a real pleasure for me to be here. I can feel a frog is entering my throat as I speak, so hopefully that won't act up too much. I have had a lot of opportunity to spend time in Canada. As a child, I used to live in New York, and we would come up to Canada where I had relatives in the Hamilton area in Toronto. So it's nice to be in Canada again and in the beautiful city of Montreal. And also a real pleasure to be here at McGill University and to see this really exciting development of the Trottier Institute for Sustainability in Engineering and Design, because I think it's a signal of transformations that are beginning at universities, and transformations that probably should have happened a long time ago, but we're now, as universities around the world, starting to catch up with the reality that we need a lot more interdisciplinarity in tackling the big questions of our planet. And those big questions are not going to be solved by engineers alone, or by social scientists alone, or by humanity experts alone. We really need this bridge among the disciplines. So I also had a real nice morning talking with several of the faculty and students here, and just seeing the openness in the atmosphere to interdisciplinarity. So very, very happy to hear that. And what I want to do is, can I press got it to being recorded? All right. Talk you through some big changes that are going on in Europe and globally right now, and thinking through with you what that might mean for us as academics, as people involved in research and innovation, and what some of the big challenges are for the next decades. So I'm going to begin the talk with climate change. It's a rather big topic, and just give you a bit of an update where we are on climate change. So this graph shows you global CO2 emissions, and it takes you through the global CO2 emissions starting back in the pre-industrial area, 1750. And you can see that basically there are no anthropogenic CO2 emissions at that point in time. And what you also see is that those emissions stayed extremely low until the mid-1800s. And then around 1880, emissions start to grow more quickly. And that's because of technological change. It's because of technological innovation. That's when we establish new technologies to be able to do deep oil and gas exploration and mass coal mining. We had those technologies in the past, but not at the scale that they were made possible by new technological changes. The Bessemer inventions made a real big change in mining and oil drilling technologies. What we also see is that emissions were very much limited to two parts of the world, Europe and North America. And you can see historically emissions very heavily in Europe and a little bit later in North America. And here we have basically the emissions that came from the first parts of the world to industrialize. From a political perspective, also extremely important, because if you are India, China, Indonesia, Brazil, you look at that and you say, you're responsible for historical emissions, and we're not. And so the legacy is something that, we hear this in Canada now. I'm always very struck when you give speeches in Canada. There is now a cultural norm to recognize the land on which you are giving a speech, and to recognize that that used to be part of a Native American, a Native people's territory. What we're seeing in the climate negotiations is the legacy of earlier periods that also happen to be tied often with colonialism. So that's one part of this graph that's important. The second part of the graph that's important is what's going on now, and that's the emissions that we see happening in other parts of the world, and especially places like China. China went from being a relatively small emitter in the 1970s to being the largest emitter in the world today. And that changes the whole discourse around responsibility. It's becoming much harder for China, which has tried to position itself as the leader of the developing countries, to say, we're not responsible. In fact, the CO2 emissions in China are so high today that China is catching up in terms of historical emissions as well. Many of you have maybe some connection to chemistry. You may know something about the greenhouse gases. You know that greenhouse gases typically are measured in relationship to carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is the largest share of those greenhouse gas emissions, roughly 80%. Other greenhouse gases, methane, the fluorides, the hydrofluorocarbons, have higher global warming potential than carbon dioxide. But I'm going to talk today primarily about carbon dioxide, just because it's the biggest in terms of mass. So that's the background, and I might come back to this in a little bit, because we essentially need to peak global emissions more or less where they're at now in the next 3 years. And then we need to drop them by almost half of the level they were in 2019, which is basically the peak of this graph, by 2030. So we have a transformation that's being demanded of us by climate science, for which we really haven't yet figured out how to deal with this politically or economically or socially. or technologically. So we have a big open playing field in front of us. And I want to point out to you that the science is moving in the direction of saying it's more serious than we thought it was 10 years ago. The climate science, the warnings are getting more and more serious, and there's increasing belief that we underestimated what was going on and how quickly we would feel the impacts of rising CO2 emissions. So, in 2022, in September, just before the latest Conference of the Parties that was held in Egypt, a group called United in Science came out with a report. And United in Science is a combination of United Nations Environment Program, World Meteorological Organization, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UK Meteorological Organization, the United Nations Disaster Relief Fund. They came together and they said, we've been looking at the science, we're looking at what needs to be done. And if we want to keep global temperatures at 2 degrees centigrade. 2 degrees centigrade is what we, back at the time the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015, we said 2 degrees centigrade, we can probably adapt to that. We can probably adapt to an average warming of 2 degrees on the planet. If we want to do that, then we have to up our ambition by 4 times current levels for 2030. And if we want to stay within 1.5 degrees, we have to up those ambitions by 7 times. What does that mean? It means that our policies and our targets that we've already established are not taking us anywhere near a 1.5 degree world. They're taking us more in the direction of a 3 degree world or even a 4 degree world. So that's one crisis that maybe needs some attention. And a second crisis is the Ukraine crisis, which I would also like to talk about. So the Ukraine crisis is a crisis on many fronts. It is an energy crisis. It is a security crisis. It is a geopolitical reordering of the world. So what you see here is a recent photo taken by a NASA satellite above Ukraine. You certainly heard about some of the missile strikes on the energy infrastructure of Ukraine. Ukraine is a country that has relied on nuclear power and on gas from Russia. So Ukraine has, I believe, 17 nuclear reactors, and Ukraine currently doesn't have access to all of the reactors in Zaporizhzhia because they've basically been put into cool mode so that there's less chance of a major explosion should there be a missile hit. And the infrastructure for electricity is being bombed. And so what does that mean? Well, this here is the sea, Black Sea, and here we have Ukraine. And you can see how dark it is in Ukraine. There's no lights because this is after one of the missile attacks across the country at the same time when they blew out all of the generators. And you can see this before and after. On the left is a normal day in Ukraine. This is January of 2022, before the war began. And on the right-hand side, you see what happened after a missile strike, and that there really is no available electricity. If you know anything about energy, you know that if you don't have electricity, then many things don't function, including your water. And you also don't have heat. So right now, Ukraine is experiencing mass blackouts in many parts of the country. Kyiv has managed to restore some of its power, but it's still working on reduced generation abilities, and that means that many households are only getting 2 to 3 hours of electricity a day. And temperatures in Ukraine can be minus 20, minus 30, minus 40 degrees centigrade. So if you don't have heat, that means your pipes freeze. So they actually have contingency plans. If Kiev gets hit again in the middle of a super cold week, they're going to have to evacuate 3 million people in the matter of a couple of days. Hard to imagine. So this is another crisis that we see going on. We have the climate crisis is the big crisis in the background. And then we have the Ukraine crisis as the immediate crisis that is making Europe rethink energy. So the European Union has been driven by climate concerns for at least the period since 1990, when the very first climate policies and laws were introduced. And there's been a lot of discussion in Europe about the need to expand renewable energy and energy efficiency, and that's all been taking its time, and slowly policies have been changing, and there's been improvements. At the same time, Europe allowed itself, and I'll say Germany in particular, to become very dependent on Russia. It was part of what we would call an Ostpolitik. Ost means east. Eastward-oriented policy. The idea being that the best way to deal with countries with different philosophies than your own is to exchange, to be in dialogue, to connect economically. You may know that the European Union is based on a treaty, the European Economic Coal and Steel Community. Was the idea that you constrain Germany by integrating the elements necessary for war into an economic structure that will make it too difficult for Germany to ever make war against its neighbors again. What are those elements? Coal and steel, right? Those were what you needed for World War I, what you needed for World War II. That was the idea of the beginnings of the European Union. You integrate those into your economies. And a similar philosophy was taken with Russia after World War II to say, after the Cold War, to say, well, maybe if we integrate more closely with the Soviet Union, with Russia, then the chances of Russia invading would be greatly reduced. A politics of, let's say, cooperation based on economic interdependence. We now look at that and say there was a big element of naivety to how that played out. And Europe allowed itself to become extremely dependent on Russian fossil fuels. So Europe was getting, I have to check the figures here, 27% of its crude oil from Russia, and over 40% both of its coal and of its gas from Europe. And unlike Canada, Europe does not have its own fossil fuels. Bit of an exaggeration. Norway has some gas and oil. The Netherlands has some gas and oil. Germany has one of the largest supplies of lignite in the world. So it does have some fossil fuels, but it doesn't really have the oil and the gas at the scale of demand. And so Europe imports over 80 to 90% of all of its fossil fuels, depending on the country. Germany was even more dependent than the European average. And Germany gets extra attention because Germany is the economic motor of Europe. Germany is a quarter of the European economy. If Germany falls, Europe falls. So Europe was in a situation where import dependency was defining politics. And if you are import dependent, that means you are also spending a lot of money, sending money into other countries. The war in Ukraine woke Europe up in a way that previous discussions about dependency had not. And it said it's a problem when energy can be turned into a political weapon. And that's what Putin has succeeded to do. Putin has turned energy into a political weapon. We never thought of energy really as a political weapon like this before. But Putin is using energy, one, to freeze the people in Ukraine, and two, to put tremendous pressure on European economies by saying, well, we're actually going to raise the price of our energy, so you have to pay a lot more for it, or we're not going to deliver it. Well, the European response has been going from energy dependence of 67% in Spain, 44% in France, over 63% in Germany. And Europe is now saying we need to become energy more or less independent of Russia. This is happening in the midst of another development, and I'm not going to call it a crisis because different countries in Europe think very differently about nuclear. Nuclear is in decline in a big way in Europe. The country that is most dependent on nuclear by far is France. You probably know that France gets about 65% of its electricity from nuclear. There just happens to be a crisis going on in France right now, and half of the nuclear power plants are not operating. And the reason they're not operating is, one, because in the summertime, climate change means that there hasn't been enough water in the rivers, and so cooling of the nuclear power plants is a problem because it's raising the temperatures of the rivers, and that's bad ecologically. And second, the nuclear power plants in France are very old, and so they're starting to have maintenance problems. So half of the nuclear power plants are shut down right now, which means that not only are there energy supply problems eastward, there's also supply problems vis-a-vis France. The second big concern area right now is the nuclear power plants in the Ukraine, because of Zaporizhzhia also being under attack, and actually several of the nuclear power plants have had to be shut down for reasons of lack of a steady energy supply. So many of them have been running on backup generators, and there's some concern about what happens if those backup generators fall out, because then you don't have the cooling that you need. So there are those kinds of crises going on. So some people are saying, well, isn't nuclear here going to be the answer? And the reality is, for Europe, no. Europe has not been building new nuclear power plants, and they take too long to build. So nuclear isn't going to come and fill the capacity gap here. So what do you do? I should perhaps also mention that countries like Germany decided after the Fukushima nuclear accident for a second time to phase out nuclear. So Germany used to have 30% of its electricity from nuclear, and now it's phasing it out. The last nuclear power plants in Germany were supposed to shut down at the end of this year. They will instead shut down in April of next year. So a 4 or 5 month extension of their time, but nuclear is on its way out in several European countries, although it might be added in some others. But like I said, it's not going to be the solution to the crises we're facing right now. We also have infrastructure security concerns that nobody had thought of before. In the last months, I've had opportunities to go to different parts of Europe, and right now in Scandinavia, there's a lot of concern about infrastructure security. There have been a lot of sightings of Russian nuclear submarines on the waters along Scandinavia, and Norway found a couple of spies, Russian spies, in their universities. And so people are kind of in alarm stage. Of course, war tensions make people scared and nervous as well. But the infrastructure security has a lot to do with the pipelines and grid infrastructure. So one of the tragedies of the politics of the last 15, 20 years was the decision by Germany against the will of Poland, Latvia, Estonia, the United States, to push through and build the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. There's already a Nord Stream 1 pipeline that takes Russian gas into Europe. But the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was to be built and expand even further European dependence, especially German dependence on Russian gas. That pipeline was built and almost ready for certification in the fall of last year. And at that time, we started to see the military buildups around Ukraine, and this certification was put on hold, and I think this project is now dead. It's a 9 billion euro technology project down the drain. Perfect example of a decision that was taken without really thinking of all of the risks associated with building this pipeline. But equally important is to know that in the last months, the pipelines are being sabotaged. And so I don't know if this news made its way here, but both the Nord Stream 1 and the Nord Stream 2 pipelines were dynamited, and huge leaks affecting North Sea waters. The methane released just from these pipeline explosions is considered to be equivalent to the CO2 emissions of Germany for a year. Here too, we have a new dimension to our thinking about energy. That we have to recognize that when we develop energy, we're moving into a new global reality, that war may be played out in different ways. And you can attack infrastructure, whether that is physical infrastructure, like pipelines, or you can use cyber warfare, and you can attack nuclear power plants and hydropower dams, etc., by hacking into computers. So this too is making Europe think about energy policy in increasingly more complex ways. I'm not saying it's making it easier. It's making us realize that we need to think about energy in ways we haven't thought about it so seriously before. And hence, this whole question of rethinking energy. And that takes me to some of the things that are going on now in Europe to respond to all of these different crises. And perhaps most important is that these crises have both short-term and long-term dimensions. So on the short term, we're doing things that make you think of what you heard from your grandparents. We're being told to take 2-minute showers, and shorter if you can, and not to heat our homes above 18 degrees centigrade in the wintertime. And at the universities, we don't heat the hallways, we don't heat the buildings at night above 16 degrees centigrade. Buildings are not being lit up at night anymore. So there's a big push to cut energy use. It's what you heard from your grandmothers: turn off the lights, right? Turn down the heater. And it's had an impact. We have cut energy demand 20 to 30%, 20% in industry, 20 to 30% in households by these simple kinds of steps. And I do it too. I take really short showers now. And my home, I've been heating at about 16 degrees centigrade. In part because I know every extra kilowatt hour I'm using is being channeled into a war that I don't agree with. So that's part of what's going on. But then we have the longer term questions, and those are the questions that become interesting also for you who may have technological backgrounds. What are the technological solutions that we might have here? Europe introduced a climate law before the war started, already in 2019, and it said that we need to move towards climate neutrality. But because of the war, the targets are being changed. And now Europe is saying we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030, and that we need climate neutrality by 2050. And I would not be surprised that Europe says those targets are too slow and too late. And we've changed our renewable energy targets. And across the entire European Union, they are now expecting 40% of the electricity in Europe to be coming from renewables, and there's push to change that up to 55%. So the demands right now for promoting renewables are very extreme. We're seeing a big push now on alternatives that might make it easier to deal with hard-to-abate sectors, cement, steel, glass. And what are the possibilities there? Hydrogen fuels are getting a lot of attention as potential ways of being able to use existing infrastructure and still find ways to support heavy industry. The Repower EU also means that Europe plans to at least triple the speed at which renewable energy is being developed. And a lot of that will be offshore, but some of it will be onshore as well. So what do we see here? We see renewable energy in Europe in its current levels. So we have back in 2010, maybe 25% of the electricity coming from renewables, and now it's rapidly approaching 40%. Big differences by country. We have Austria up here and Denmark up here. Denmark is going to be 100% renewables probably within the next 3 to 4 years. So we have some countries that are really, really leading. Germany is just shy of 50% of its electricity from renewables today. The plan is to be at 80% at 2030 and 100% at 2035, with the electrification of the transport sector being added into that. So this means a massive build-out of renewables. It means that you have new building standards here. You can no longer build a house without building photovoltaic onto it. France just passed a law that all parking lots need to be covered by photovoltaic. All heating systems as of 2024 have to be at least 65% renewable energy based, and retrofitting of old buildings. So there are efforts to replace or structure, what do you call it, the energy systems of old buildings at a rate of 2% per year. The targets are high. Implementation is still a problem. I don't want to say that everything I'm talking about here is just going to smoothly happen. In fact, it's going to be a massive challenge getting public acceptance, getting the worker capacity to do it. We don't have the technical know-how in the population at large for a lot of these things. But thinking is changing. Here you can see, progress. This is where we're at. This is where we need to go on the new target. And I wouldn't be surprised that the target changes again soon. So targets are going up and up and up. That takes us also in the direction of thinking about energy beyond immediate, obvious energy. And this is embedded energy. Energy that we have in our products, energy that we have in our buildings. We are now starting to say that if we really want to get to these targets, then we have to rethink our economies at a deeper scale. So it means that instead of just recycling paper and glass and aluminum that we've been doing since the 1970s, we need to rethink manufacturing at its base. So that means that in the future, when an automobile is built, it needs to be built in such a way that you can remove every single part and recycle it. BMW came out with the first prototype last year of a 100% recycled automobile. Pretty fancy looking thing. It's not on the market, but it is an effort to say that the way products have been made in the past has been without thinking about the whole life cycle. And that means that we lose a huge amount of energy because we're wasting all that material that's been produced and is only used once and then is thrown away. And so we now have what we call the Green Deal, and it basically is saying we need to have a circular economy in all sectors. It's beginning easily. It means plastic bottles have to now have they have to have plastic recycled content. 25%, 50% will soon be the level. It means getting rid of one-way plastics. That's starting to pick up in more parts of the world. But it's going well beyond that. And it's saying that at the design stage, we have to think first of what's the material base of the products that we're designing. So can we use materials that are regenerative materials? Can we go back to nature and find materials that can more easily be recycled and regenerated? And it means that designing those products has to be done in such a way that they can also be undesigned, taken apart at the end of their useful life and brought back into a circular economy. So we are now also, for example, looking at buildings and saying 30 to 40% of energy use is in the building sector. It's cement, it's steel, and this is massively impacting energy. It's not just energy use in the building itself, it's the building. And so now we're really thinking, do we need to rethink architecture and what are the materials we use to build with? And what happens to the building at the end of its lifetime? Basically, we just explode buildings now and then we truck off the waste. That will not be the future anymore. The future will be, we need to be able to recycle our buildings. And pretty soon they will have standards. So you will not only see what is the energy use of an office or a building, you will see what's the footprint of the building. Because if we don't do that, then we will also continue to see tropical deforestation, destruction, and we will continue to see excessive mining, etc. So the European Green Deal has as targets climate neutrality 2050, zero pollution by 2050, impacting agriculture, but also industrial emissions, and the push towards full circularity. So how are we doing? Well, this is a little bit German for you. CO2 emissions, this is gas use. This was just before the war began, and this is today. Germany is not importing gas from Russia anymore. We are instead importing gas from Norway, from Qatar, LNG from the United States and from Canada via the United States, and reducing demand. And the same with steinkohl is hard coal and oil. We're still importing a little bit, but basically the goal is to break that financial dependence, also because that's been funding the war. We have spent a lot of months trying to save energy so that we can fill the gas tanks and do that to carry us over the winter. This winter won't be a problem. Next winter and the winter after that could be a problem. We filled the tanks with Russian gas this summer. Next year, we won't have that Russian gas, and it'll have to come from LNG tankers and alternative pipelines like from Norway. So pressure, economic pressure, is going to be intense. Our gas bill went from, let's just say the gas bill is about 2.5 times as expensive as it was before. My electricity is now 54 cents per kilowatt hour. I don't know what you're paying here in Canada. I'm guessing it's probably something like 10 cents a kilowatt hour. So you can imagine what that starts to mean for economic competitiveness when businesses are facing super high prices. But as I said, people are saving energy. So this is gas use in 2022 in orange, and this was in 2021. And you can see that there have been a lot of moves by industry to cut their gas use. And the same is true. Orange here is in households, and you can see a real cut in the amount of gas use in households. Europe is also now thinking much more as Europe, and it's starting to say we cannot deal with this challenge alone. Europe needs to come together and really work together, because the war in Ukraine is also basically seen as a war on European values and norms. So the gas networks, many of which were bringing gas from Russia into Europe, are now being used in reverse flow. So we are now sending gas to Ukraine. The gas that used to flow from Russia via Ukraine into Europe, now we're using those pipelines in reverse flow, and we are sending gas to try to help Ukraine make it through the winter. And we are sending generators to try to help Ukraine make it through the winter. Nowhere near enough, but there are now a lot of calls for strengthening the European infrastructure network, recognizing that this network is also vulnerable to attacks. Yeah, maybe I'll skip these here. These are imports from the US and the UK. Yeah, I think I'm going to end the talk there just so we have a chance to have a little bit of discussion. But my answer to the question, can crises have transformative impacts? And I would say yes. Not only can they are having dramatic transformative impacts. These impacts may lead to political opposition as energy prices go through the roof. But so far, Europeans are holding together and saying we need to do this because we care about our values. And I think the big question will be how quickly that transition to renewables can be made, so that the dependencies on fossil fuels can be reduced, and in the long run, security can in that way be enhanced. So, thank you. Yeah.
I mean, I'm from Germany, right? I could agree to Thanks for the presentation. When you mentioned at the beginning, especially Europe or Germany in particular, was really naive. Back in the day when Schröder started this, before Chancellor Merkel and Scholz, we didn't know that Putin would turn out. But the Russian people are all nice people, right? So the plan was good, but now everybody thinks to be no better. But we have now the same problem potentially with China, right? Maybe not on the energy sector, but maybe on all the other technologies that are produced there, right? So that is maybe the next best challenge, or the next challenge that Europe, but also North America especially, will face, right? Hopefully we can learn from that and see how to deal with, now maybe a similar kind of country, a similar kind of mentality, like Russia, like China. So I don't want to say anything against China, but they're moving against or in this direction potentially, right?
Yeah, so very good point. One of the things that the war in the Ukraine has made Europe aware of is its overdependence on some suppliers for some things. And very interestingly, it goes as far as the United Kingdom. We have most of our financial banking euro transactions done through London, and Europe is about to change its policies and say that's not going to be allowed anymore because more of that needs to be done domestically, because you never know what could happen with an external development. And with China, the same thing. The idea that Europe is so remarkably dependent on China for its exports, but also for the import of certain products, also for the renewable energy sector. And so now there are lots of talk and some first moves to bring certain manufacturing back to Europe. So I think one of the big lessons of the war in Ukraine is that interdependency isn't bad, but overdependence is a problem. You diversify.
This is really interesting. I mean, so I have a few publications looking at infrastructure effects, and often from a technical standpoint. And we were actually, we really found that in a lot of fragile or war-torn states, it starts to then become completely not technical, and obviously about things like post-war impacts from strikes on energy infrastructure. And so it just really got me thinking, because the point of that paper was, we talked a lot about solutions, and then there's often this disconnect between policy and implementation. So I'm wondering if, from your perspective, because this is really, a lot about over-dependence and flows of pipeline and large-scale, top-down types of vertical structures of large energy generation. If there is, if it's generated or kind of sparks more policy discussion about in support of distributed energy systems, because if you're sending up, presumably the generators you're sending up there are probably diesel generators. So this is, the whole thing is like pipeline, a whole bunch of methane emissions and a lot of distributed diesel generators. But how can we start to conceive of, like, is it really sparking a lot of these discussions about how to better manage these issues and what will happen afterwards?
For Ukraine, the discussion is a Marshall Plan for Ukraine at the end of the war to turn Ukraine into a renewable energy leader. The very centralized energy system from Soviet days is turning into a real problem for Ukraine. The buildings have centralized heating, which means that if a generator goes down, the whole building goes down. And what's being considered, at least in discussions now, is how Ukraine could be helped with developing renewable energy at the end of the war. And distributed energy, I think, has also gotten a real boost in its image because of what's happening now, also with what's happening in France. So all of the proponents of a more nuclear-based energy system are having to deal with the reality that when you're too dependent on the centralized nuclear, you also are at risk should you have problems like they're having right now. So the more decentralized systems, which have their own problems. I mean, it's not that decentralized systems make it easy for heavy industry. They need a lot of electricity. But I think we're going to see more of that also because of our growing recognition that in the future we're going to have infrastructure wars. And if you have a more distributed, decentralized system, then you can isolate islands more easily, and then the whole system doesn't go down. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for your talk. So, looking at, say, Europe from a Canadian or North American perspective, so you could say, well, you know, we are on the energy front, we have a lot of natural resources, but it can also be a curse. That is, we don't have this crisis to manage, and we're already lagging behind in terms of emissions, right? And now, suddenly, the oil industry is doing very well in Canada because oil prices, you know, the oil prices increased so dramatically in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so you see now in the oil patch in Alberta, you know, oil sands that now maybe it will expand even more and so forth if prices are still up. So what do you think is, you know, from a North American perspective, and I know you're originally from the US, you know the US, you wrote about the US, is this crisis in Europe in a way will just increase the lag between us and Europe, that the energy transition will go faster and faster in Europe, and in here, because of these the higher oil prices, will actually keep producing more because now it's really profitable, right? So is it in a way a curse for us, what's happening in Europe in a sense, or at least a curse in disguise, because, you know, what might look good in the short run might be bad in the long run from an environmental standpoint? I'm not sure if my question is clear. But
it is. Yeah, thanks for the question. And it adds to some of the contradictions that we sometimes see in the world, right? But I think there's 3 or 4 things I'd like to say in response. And one is that, yes, around the world, the oil companies, gas companies have had windfall profits. And we're seeing a lot of political backlash and calls for windfall taxes. British Petroleum was just told they either donate that money for renewable energy developments and assisting Ukraine, or they get taxed. They have a choice. I think we're going to see a lot more of that very soon. Second thing, I get a lot of questions from younger students who are all very concerned about the future, and do they have a future, and will they be swimming because they live in Florida or something and sea levels are rising. And I say that we may be at a really exciting turning point, because we've gotten to the stage where the policy targets are now, they're pretty ambitious. They're not enough, but they're pretty ambitious compared to where we're at, that it's going to kick in a technological race that is going to be so rapid and so important. So what's happening in Europe means that we've got this speed up of a transformation that was already beginning, but it's being sped up by Putin, right? At the same time in the US, the infrastructure bill and the inflation reduction bill, they are going to wake US industry up and mean that you're going to have investments flowing into clean technologies that are going to help reduce prices. It's going to open new opportunities. China's in there too. I mean, China's not going to want to lose out on this economic competition either. So I think we are about to hit what you might call the clean energy technology race. And that gives you some hope that we might have some breakthroughs on efficiency and maybe some new possibilities with new technologies. At the same time, there may be, with a younger generation, also some lifestyle changes that are happening. Young people in Europe say, I don't want a car. And I know that's not true here, but in densely populated places, a lot of people are saying a car is more trouble than it's worth. And I think also thinking is changing. People are saying we don't want roads to be used for parking places. We want roads to be used for children so they can play outside. And that's changing the dialogue a little bit. So maybe we'll also see some changes, not from all parts of the planet, but once people start to see what can be done, it also opens new possibilities.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Some of the interesting ideas there. One thing I'm very interested in is how much energy use reduction Germany was able to do in a very short time. And I think this is something that has been talked about, how to get this to happen over the last decade. Things like rising energy prices, right? And now we see that's being enforced. And I think, as you say, some of these things might be blessings in disguise, not quite that, but if they're being forced to have high energy prices, being forced to become more efficient, and being forced to make these transitions which will actually help us address climate change, maybe we actually have a lot to learn from the experience that's going on in Europe.
For me, this is the second time in modern times that I've really seen a society make a big cut in energy demand. The first time was in Japan after Fukushima, when electricity demand was cut by 15 to 20%, and everybody said, oh, it'll be short term. It hasn't been short term. It's been sustained. And that's quite amazing, that we are often led to believe that we can't change human behavior, but in fact we can to a point. But there has to be an understanding that it's important and that people have to buy into the idea. Yeah, please.
Thanks very much. You know, your title slide talked about can crises have transformative impacts? And so I come at this more from a political science, international relations perspective, and some of the writing that we've seen in that field, reflecting partly on climate change but more on the pandemic, has argued that lots of times crises don't bring about transformative change. We have this mantra that the crisis is so bad, therefore we will have transformative change. And many people argued that would happen with COVID-19, that the crisis would bring about transformative change, but it actually hasn't. It has, at least in political, in political terms. So I'm wondering what you would respond to that. Is it that with this particular crisis, it's a level of gravity? Is it that this is more likely to bring about behavior change than other types of crises? I'm just trying to get a sense of, I mean, I normatively believe in what you're putting on your first slide, but I've read a lot of material in the last year and a half that tries to explain why transformative change doesn't follow crisis. And a lot of that is psychological literature about cognitive limitations, about political narratives, that for a moment after a crisis you have kind of this explosion of different kinds of narratives. But very quickly people tack to particular voices kind of have dominance. And that even though we might wish for new kind of mechanisms, we don't see them. So, you know, I know you don't necessarily engage with that kind of literature so much, but I'm trying to get a sense of how we should comparatively think about this crisis compared to others.
Yeah, so it's true. I mean, we live in a world of constant crises, and a lot of those crises don't get us to do anything. You know, the latest food security crisis in Africa, you barely pay attention, right? You know it's happening and it's terrible, and yet it doesn't really lead to change. So not all crises lead to transformative change by any means. I would actually say COVID had more transformative change than you are saying right now. I think it's quite remarkable. It has, you know, we're having a hybrid session here right now, and that certainly wouldn't have happened without COVID. 3 years ago, that wouldn't have happened. So I think it's led to some really big changes in education, in communication, in businesses. People don't travel for business in the same way they used to. But of course, there are limits to how much transformative change went on there. So you can ask, what's the definition of transformative change? But I think here with the climate crisis, we have an existential risk. And we have an existential risk that was leading to efforts by policymakers to bring about change, and they were doing it, but kind of slowly and with a lot of resistance from incumbents. And I think what the crisis on top of the crisis, the Ukraine war, it's a window of opportunity for policymakers to say, we can do now what we couldn't have done earlier, or it would have taken us 10 years to do the same thing. So in this window of the Ukraine crisis, when we suddenly said, if we don't do something now, German industry collapses, literally collapses, because the gas industry, the petrochemical industry, the automobile industry, all are dependent on gas. And if we don't do something overnight, forget recession, you'll see a 15% drop in the German GDP. And along with it goes Europe, right? That's an immediate economic crisis that the politicians were able to use. And it so happens that we had political parties that were also very concerned about climate change, and they could couple those things together.
That gives part of an answer is in leadership, right? So that
Yeah.
makes a difference, which I'm also seeing in some of the work that I've read. I mean, I absolutely agree with you on the technology around COVID. What I was more referring to is the crisis didn't actually, I would argue, help the world prepare for the next pandemic as well.
Okay.
In terms of pharmaceutical products, but in terms of the mechanisms we have globally to help us with the next pandemic, the window of opportunity closed.
Yeah.
But here I think you're saying in Germany, there's some good factors at play around what political leadership was able to do.
Yeah, I'm going to take the question in the back first. Yeah.
For the talk. So just a question, in the context of this being framed as like a crisis, it's kind of weird in comparison to COVID, at least, because German energy policy and European energy policy over the last 10 years has been, I don't want to say stable, but it's been a trend, right? I mean, people, like, external viewpoints have noted 5 years ago that there might be issues with German reliances on Russian oil and stuff like this, Russian gas. And it goes back even farther, 10 to 15 years on this type of topic. So if there's a continuous behavior that's occurring in Germany when it comes to policy, is not what's being proposed here an amplification of that policy? And is that amplification supposed to produce a different result? Or what differentiates the new policy proposed, at least at the last couple of slides, compared to the older policies?
The older policies were leading to the development of renewable energy in the power sector at the rate of 1% or 2% more per year, slowly chugging along. Nothing happened in the transport sector. Nothing happened in the building sector. Nothing happened in the circular economy sector. And that's where the transformations are now happening. So it's not that the ideas weren't around before. They were there. But now there's momentum behind the ideas, and there's actual, not just framework policies, but actual regulations being established that are, you will soon not be able to sell many products in Europe if you do not show that they have recycled content, if you cannot show that they're sustainably harvested materials, if you cannot show that you have a plan for end of the life cycle. And those are our new developments.
Maybe a point when you mentioned, or to your question, I think Germany and Europe, they have learned from the crisis, right? Because it's really in their backyard, right? But here in North America, Canada, and United States, I think most of the people, they just don't care. I don't give it, right? So what could you tell actually Trudeau and all the people in North American governments? Okay, what would you learn, or how would you behave? I think we as Canadians would do something suddenly. Trump would invade if he comes to power Canada, right? So then it's a crisis directly in our backyard, right? But Germany or Europe or Ukraine is too far away from North America, right? For me personally, not, or for other people who are people there. So they were directly affected. Right?
And just to add something, when the energy, the cabinet minister here in Quebec said you have to be careful, don't consume as much energy, people laughed at him. Because they say we have so much hydropower here, right? So people are not taking that seriously, in part because we have so much, in that case, green energy already. But then we have to build new dams, and we have issues with, now how to negotiate with indigenous peoples and so forth. So, this is becoming a big challenge here, but people don't realize that there is a crisis in a way, from our perspective here.
Yeah, that's interesting that the sense of crisis is very different when you're in Europe than when you're here. I think for Canada, one of the big challenges will be how not to be left behind. Canada has the resource curse potential. A country that is blessed with fossil fuel and other resources that can make it difficult for you to go in the direction of technological advancement. Because it's easy to just keep doing what you've always been doing and stay in the old model rather than move along with the new model. And the new model is going to be developing those technologies that help other parts of the world that don't have those resources deal with their resource scarcity through really efficient technologies, etc. Or the fact that globally you're going to start seeing a pricing of carbon that could make it very difficult to do business in Canada. And Europe will close the market if you're not playing with the game. You will not have access to the European market. And China right now has been pushed along on its products and standards because it wants access to the European market. So I think that could put a lot of pressure on Canada. And the other reality is that Canada is heavily influenced by what happens in the U.S., right? So if the U.S. starts transforming because of infrastructure bill, then Canada's going to have to play along, right? You can't do your own system when you're as dependent on exports to the U.S. as you are. But I can see the challenge. I mean, I look at U.S. and Canada. I come here and I'll be honest, I'm horrified by the amount of trash that I see here. I stayed in a hotel in Ottawa, and every morning there was like a little mountain of garbage that I produced at the breakfast table because everything was packaged and overpackaged. And there's still some big steps that need to happen in changing behavior and thinking. I think most Canadians think they're very environmental, partly because you're in a location with a beautiful environment. But it's necessary to really get people to think differently.
I think it's a good point, especially here in Quebec, where we think we are so green because we compare ourselves with Alberta and Saskatchewan. But if we compare ourselves with people who are leading in that area, then we are not doing so well. Right? It's a good point. Thank you.
We've been having a great discussion here, but let's see if there's a online question.
There's one question. So one of the viewers is wondering, what are the short and long-term policy instruments to control prices in cases of emergencies like war and market shocks?
Yeah, so I mentioned what was happening with electricity prices that are going through the roof. I can afford it, and it's not that big a deal, but a lot of families can't. Right? Families who have low incomes, a lot of children are already dealing with high housing prices. So the governments in Europe are coming in with basically subsidies for households. And in order to make sure that the subsidies don't reduce the drive for efficiency, what they're doing is they're subsidizing you at, I think in the German case, 80% of your usage of the previous year, but not the last 20%. It's probably not enough. It probably should be, in terms of an efficiency, 20% is not that much to really drive change. Maybe if it was at 60%, you would really be driven to be energy efficient. But
last
yeah.
question from, okay, go ahead. I guess you didn't get to ask the question.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the talk. Basically, I'm from Pakistan. I don't know if you heard the name or no, but in the recent, like in this year, we had like record floods, and almost 8 million people were displaced. More than 2,500 died, and almost 1/3 of the country was underwater.
Yeah.
And if we see the global greenhouse gases emission of Pakistan, like contribution of Pakistan, it's just maybe 0.9% of the world. So, like, we discussed that because of some crazy actions of Russian political president, political leader, Europe suffered, Germany suffered. So I shouldn't say like in the same way, but kind of same way, because of the actions of the developing nations, the underdeveloping countries like us, they're suffering.
Yep.
So what do you think like should be the measures by those developing countries who are mainly responsible for those greenhouse emissions? What should they do like to help at least the underdeveloped countries? I'm not saying that it's completely responsibility of those nations, but at least they need to have some share of that responsibility.
Right.
So what do you suggest like those countries should give the share to the underdeveloping countries to help them mitigate these climate crises?
Yeah. I've been giving a lot of talks also on climate change, where I go much more deeply into what was happening in Sharm el-Sheikh, and the big development at Sharm el-Sheikh for the conference of the parties was something called loss and damage, a loss and damage fund. It's something developing countries have been demanding for 20 years, at least 20 years, to say, we don't have historical responsibility for climate change, but we're the ones who are being impacted by it most heavily, because developing countries also don't have the capacities to adapt as easily. You know, the Pakistan floods, in the other talk that I could have given, I have a slide where I show what happened in 2022. As I was making the slides, Pakistan was 1/3 underwater. China had experienced its worst drought on record. The United States was suffering temperatures in the high 40s. The year before, Canada had 50 degrees. And so, you know, it was climate crisis after climate crisis just about everywhere. And so we're starting to see that the climate impacts are getting worse, and that developing countries are going to need assistance. So the Sharm el-Sheikh conference is criticized for not doing more to help reduce emissions faster, but it did manage to get at least a climate fund for loss and damage. So that means it still needs to be developed, but it means that there's going to be big pockets. There's going to be some pockets of money that are established to help deal with that kind of impact. That is nowhere near enough. What we need to do is another development we're starting to see. They're called climate clubs. And it's countries like Canada working together with a specific developing country and saying, we are going to help you to get out of coal and instead to develop another alternative for energy development, so that you don't have the problem of not being able to develop, but you can develop in a clean way. So multiple things need to happen. One is to help countries like Pakistan deal with the impact, but the second is to help them develop the capacity to move right into a sustainable economy and not follow the path that the other countries did. But what I'm saying now, it all sounds great. The reality of it is the amount of money that's going into these pockets are, it's a drop in an ocean of problems. And there's one other challenge. Not all developing countries function very well. And there's also a lot of corruption. And so we have to find ways to make sure that when that money is being transferred, it's really going into the projects where it needs to go into, because otherwise donors won't give that money at all anymore.
Susan, if you have a last quick one, go ahead.
I just had a quick question about the energy point of view. Did Germany consider using increasing block rate tariffs for energy? Because then that would solve two problems. It would reduce the energy demand and it would force people to become more efficient in their energy use and would be equitable.
They're talking about whether or not we should meter at different times for different prices, but there's a privacy problem in Germany. Data protection is so strong it makes it very difficult. But the changes that are happening in Germany are happening so fast and furious that I'm not sure that I'm up to date on all the very latest changes, because it's almost on a daily basis that policies are being changed right now. So I'm not 100% up to date on the latest changes being made to the energy structures.
Well, thank you, Dr. Schreurs, for the
You're welcome.
presentation and the discussion and sharing the wisdom. So with that, I guess we'll close today's event today. Thank you all for coming, and have a great rest of the afternoon.